I've put off making this video for a while now. Not because the science is complicated, it isn't, and not because there's any real uncertainty left in what's happening. I've put it off because the honest version of this story doesn't have a hopeful ending stapled onto it, and most of the videos I make do. This one doesn't, and I think pretending otherwise would be worse than just telling you what's actually going on. Between early 2023 and mid-2025, the planet lived through the largest coral bleaching event ever recorded. Not the worst in a specific country, not the worst on one reef system, the worst ever documented globally, since scientists started tracking this in the late 1990s. 84% of the world's coral reef area was exposed to bleaching-level heat stress, spread across 80-something countries, and every ocean basin that contains coral reefs at all. And the part that actually kept me from wanting to sit down and write this video isn't the number itself. It's what the pattern behind that number tells us about what happens next. I want to start with the actual mechanism, because I think a lot of people have a vague sense that bleaching means coral turning white and dying. And that's not quite right, and the distinction matters for understanding why this specific event is different from the ones before it. Coral itself is an animal, a small polyp related to sea anemones and jellyfish, but the color and a huge portion of a coral's actual energy supply comes from a microscopic algae called Zooxanthellae that lives inside the coral's tissue in a close, mutually dependent relationship. The coral provides the algae shelter and access to sunlight. The algae, in turn, photosynthesizes and shares a large share of the resulting food energy directly with its coral host. In some reef systems, supplying the overwhelming majority of the energy the coral needs to survive, grow, and build the calcium carbonate skeleton that forms a reef's physical structure. When water temperatures rise too far above what a given coral colony is adapted to, even by just a degree or two Celsius sustained over several weeks, the relationship between coral and algae breaks down. The stressed coral expels its algae, and since the algae is what gives coral its color, the coral tissue turns a stark, ghostly white, exposing the translucent tissue and calcium carbonate skeleton underneath. That's bleaching. It's not death, at least not immediately. A bleached coral is alive, but severely stressed, cut off from most of its normal energy supply, and if water temperatures drop back down to a tolerable range reasonably quickly, some corals can recover, recruiting new algae back into their tissue and gradually regaining both their color and their health. The problem is the word if. Bleaching is a stress response with a genuine recovery window attached to it. Not an instant death sentence, but that window has been narrowing, event by event, decade by decade, for exactly the reason you'd expect. The underlying ocean temperatures that trigger bleaching in the first place keep climbing, and they're not climbing in a way that gives reefs time to catch their breath between events anymore. This is where the actual sit with it for a second problem lives. And it's not really about any single bleaching event, it's about the spacing between them. The first documented global coral bleaching event happened in 1998. Affecting roughly 21% of the world's reefs, tied to a strong El Niño that pushed ocean temperatures up across the tropical Pacific and beyond. The second global event followed in 2010, affecting closer to 37% of reefs. The third arrived between 2014 and 2017, stretching across 3 consecutive years and affecting roughly 2/3 of the world's reef area. At the time, the most severe and widespread bleaching event ever recorded. Then came the fourth event, confirmed by NOAA and the International Coral Reef Initiative in April 2024, though bleaching-level heat stress had actually already been building since February 2023. By May 2024, just over a year in, more than 60% of the world's reefs had already experienced bleaching-level stress, a threshold the third global event had taken years to reach. By March 2025, that figure had climbed to 84%, formally making it the most extensive coral bleaching event ever documented, surpassing the previous record set less than a decade earlier. NOAA's Coral Reef Watch Coordinator, Derek Manzello, confirmed the event had likely concluded by mid-2025, following a final bookending bleaching episode in Western Australia in early 2025, with no further widespread bleaching reported through the following Southern Hemisphere summer. Lay those 4 events out next to each other and the pattern isn't subtle. 21%, then 37%, then roughly 2/3, then 84%, over a period of roughly 27 years. Each event has been more severe and more geographically widespread than the one before it, and the third and fourth events in particular arrived considerably closer together in time than the gap that separated the earlier ones. Every documented global bleaching event since 1998 has coincided with a strong El Niño, the same natural Pacific warming cycle that periodically pushes global temperatures up on its own. What's changed isn't the existence of El Niño. That cycle has been running for thousands of years. What's changed is the baseline ocean temperature that each new El Niño is now adding heat on top of, a baseline that keeps climbing year over year, regardless of where the natural cycle happens to sit. A few features of the 2023-2025 event specifically are worth sitting with because they go beyond simply the biggest one yet and point towards something structurally different happening in how reefs are experiencing heat stress now. The Great Barrier Reef, likely the most intensively studied reef system on the planet, experienced what the Australian Institute of Marine Science described as its biggest single-year drop in live coral cover since monitoring of this kind began in the 1980s, with the early 2024 mass bleaching event ranked as the most widespread and severe bleaching the reef system has ever recorded, affecting both its northern and southern zones simultaneously, something that hadn't previously happened in a single bleaching event at this reef. That detail, the northern and southern reef experiencing severe bleaching in the same event, matters more than it might initially sound like. Historically, different sections of large reef systems have sometimes been buffered from each other, a warm pocket of water hitting one region while a neighboring region stays cooler, giving reef managers and researchers at least a partial refuge to study and protect while the damaged section recovered. When an entire reef system experiences severe stress simultaneously across its full length, that kind of internal refuge effectively disappears. Scientists have also specifically flagged the shrinking gap between events as the core structural problem, more concerning in some ways than the raw severity of any single event on its own. Coral reefs, given enough time between stress events, genuinely can and do recover, at least partially, rebuilding lost coral cover over a period of years to decades, depending on the specific reef and the species involved. But that recovery process takes time the reefs are increasingly not getting. If severe bleaching events keep arriving closer together, a reef that's still in the middle of recovering from one event gets hit again before that recovery is complete, and each successive hit starts from a lower baseline of coral cover than the one before it. Researchers working on this specific pattern have warned that under current warming trajectories, mass bleaching could become a near-annual occurrence across the majority of the world's reefs by around 2050, a timeline that leaves essentially no meaningful recovery window at all between events. This is the part of the story that made me genuinely reluctant to sit down and write this script, because it's not speculative language from an activist group, it's showing up now in formal scientific risk assessments. The Global Tipping Points Report, a major scientific assessment published in 2025 by an international consortium of climate researchers, specifically identified warm water coral reef die-off as the first climate tipping point the planet has already crossed, rather than one still approaching in the future. A tipping point, in the specific scientific sense researchers use the term, describes a threshold beyond which a system shifts into a fundamentally different and often self-reinforcing state that doesn't reverse itself even if the original triggering condition, in this case rising ocean temperature, were to later ease off. The assessment's conclusion was that shallow warm water tropical and subtropical coral reefs are now crossing exactly that kind of threshold, moving into a state of unprecedented accelerating die-off rather than experiencing a temporary recoverable stress event. I want to be careful and precise about what that finding does and doesn't mean, because tipping point gets thrown around loosely in a lot of climate coverage, and this specific claim deserves more precision than that. It doesn't mean every coral reef on the planet is about to die within the next few years. Reef systems vary enormously in their resilience, their species composition, their exposure to local stressors beyond temperature, and their proximity to cooler water refuges, and some reefs, particularly in regions with naturally higher temperature variability where local coral populations have already adapted to a wider thermal tolerance range, are likely to persist considerably longer than others. What the tipping point framing does mean is that, at a global aggregate level, the rate of reef loss now appears to be outpacing the rate of reef recovery, consistently, and that the gap between those two rates is not expected to close under current warming trends, meaning the overall trajectory for warm water coral reefs, taken as a whole planetary system, points toward continued escalating loss rather than stabilization or recovery. That's a genuinely different and considerably more sobering claim than reefs are having a rough decade. It's a claim that the fundamental balance between damage and recovery has shifted, and that shift is now expected to persist and continue compounding rather than being an unusually bad stretch that the system will eventually work its way back from on its own. Part of why the numbers behind this event carry as much weight as they do comes down to how they're actually measured, and it's worth walking through that briefly because the tracking system itself has become considerably more sophisticated since the first global event in 1998. NOAA's Coral Reef Watch program, the primary source for the global figures cited throughout this video, relies on satellite-based sea surface temperature monitoring, combined with a metric called degree heating weeks, which accumulates how far above a location's normal maximum summer temperature the water has climbed, and for how long over a rolling 12-week window. That accumulated heat stress measure correlates closely with observed bleaching severity on the ground, which means researchers can generate daily, near real-time bleaching risk maps for reef systems across the entire planet without needing a diver or research vessel physically present at every single reef to confirm what's happening. Satellite coverage is then cross-checked against direct field observations submitted by researchers, reef managers, and citizen science networks worldwide, which is how NOAA and the International Coral Reef Initiative confirm whether a bleaching signal detected from orbit is actually translating into observed bleaching on the reef itself, rather than remaining a purely theoretical heat stress reading. This combination of satellite monitoring and ground-truthed field data is a relatively recent capability. During the first global bleaching event in 1998, monitoring relied far more heavily on scattered field reports from individual research stations and diving expeditions, with nowhere near the systematic near-global daily coverage available today. That's part of why direct comparisons between the severity of the 1998 event and the 2023-2025 event carry a small but real asterisk. Today's monitoring system is considerably better at detecting bleaching across remote or poorly studied reef systems than what existed at the end of the 1990s, meaning at least some portion of the apparent increase in global bleaching extent over the past 3 decades likely reflects improved detection capability layered on top of a genuine underlying increase in ocean heat stress. Researchers working on this question have generally concluded that improved detection explains only a modest fraction of the overall trend, and that the core pattern, worsening, more frequent, more geographically extensive bleaching, holds up as a genuine signal even after accounting for better monitoring, but it's a caveat worth stating plainly rather than glossing over. It's worth looking specifically at what happened during the recovery windows between the earlier global bleaching events, because that history is actually where a lot of the current concern is coming from, rather than from the severity of any single event viewed in isolation. Following the 2014-2017 third global bleaching event, several intensively studied reef systems, including sections of the Great Barrier Reef, did show measurable recovery over the following few years, with live coral cover rebuilding in areas that had experienced significant bleaching-related mortality. That recovery wasn't uniform. Some coral species, particularly fast-growing branching corals, rebounded considerably faster than slower-growing, structurally important species like massive boulder corals, which can take many decades to regrow to their pre-bleaching size even under favorable conditions. But the broader pattern was genuinely encouraging at the time. Given roughly 6 or 7 years without another severe, widespread heat stress event, reef systems that had been significantly damaged were able to claw back a meaningful portion of their lost coral cover. The 2023 to 2025 event arrived roughly 6 years after that prior recovery period began in earnest, which sits right at the edge of what researchers had previously considered a plausible minimum recovery window for at least partial rebound. Whether that timing was close enough to allow reefs to have genuinely recovered before this new event hit, or whether it arrived while recovery was still meaningfully incomplete, is a question researchers are still actively assessing on a reef-by-reef basis. But the early data from heavily studied systems like the Great Barrier Reef, specifically that record single-year drop in live coral cover, suggests that at least some reef systems were hit again before they'd had the chance to fully rebuild what the previous event had cost them. I want to be direct about where genuine scientific uncertainty remains in this story, because treating every part of it as equally settled would be its own kind of dishonesty, just pointed in the opposite direction from false optimism. The precise timing and severity of future bleaching events remains genuinely difficult to forecast with confidence more than a year or two in advance, since it depends heavily on the timing and intensity of future El Niño cycles, which are themselves only predictable within a relatively narrow forecasting window. The 2050 near-annual bleaching projection cited by several research teams is a long-range trend extrapolation based on current warming trajectories continuing roughly as they have been, not a fixed certain outcome, and it would shift in either direction if global emissions trends change meaningfully from their current path. There's also real, ongoing scientific debate about exactly how much weight to place on the specific tipping point framing used in the 2025 assessment, versus describing the same underlying data in more incremental terms, a reef system undergoing severe, accelerating decline rather than one that has crossed a single, sharply defined threshold into an entirely new and irreversible state. Different researchers reasonably favor different framings here, and the underlying data, worsening bleaching frequency and severity, outpacing documented recovery capacity, isn't really in dispute, regardless of which specific framing a given research team prefers to use when communicating it. It's worth being concrete about why any of this matters beyond the reefs themselves, because coral reefs occupy a genuinely unusual position. They cover a tiny fraction of the ocean floor, well under 1% by most estimates, while supporting a wildly disproportionate share of marine biodiversity and a substantial amount of direct human economic activity built on top of that biodiversity. Coral reef ecosystems provide habitat, breeding ground, and nursery function for an enormous proportion of marine species, particularly reef fish populations that a huge number of coastal communities depend on directly for food security and livelihood. The Global Tipping Points report specifically noted that warm water reef collapse threatens the livelihoods of close to 1 billion people worldwide who depend directly or indirectly on healthy reef systems, whether through fishing, tourism, or the coastal protection reefs provide against storm surge and wave erosion. That coastal protection function in particular tends to get overlooked in conversations focused mainly on biodiversity, but reef structures physically absorb and dissipate wave energy before it reaches shorelines. And as reef structures degrade and lose their physical complexity, communities behind them lose a meaningful portion of that natural buffer against increasingly severe coastal storms, a genuinely serious secondary consequence layered on top of the direct ecological and economic losses. Tourism built around healthy reef systems represents billions of dollars in economic activity globally, concentrated disproportionately in developing coastal economies that often have comparatively few alternative sources of foreign revenue and employment to fall back on if that tourism declines. And fisheries directly tied to reef ecosystems support both subsistence, food security, and commercial economic activity for millions of people across the tropics, populations who, in many cases, have contributed the least to the greenhouse gas emissions, actually driving the ocean warming, now threatening the resource they depend on. I don't want to leave this entirely bleak because that wouldn't be accurate either, and I think there's a meaningful difference between honest caution and manufactured despair. There are genuine, scientifically grounded reasons some reef systems, and some coral species specifically, may weather this differently than a purely worst-case reading of the tipping point framing might suggest. Coral thermal tolerance isn't uniform across species or even across individual colonies of the same species. Researchers have documented measurable variation in heat resilience, both between different coral species and within populations of the same species living in different local conditions, and some of that variation appears to have a genuine genetic basis, rather than being purely a product of short-term environmental acclimation. That natural variation is the raw material several active restoration and research programs are now working with directly, identifying naturally more heat-tolerant coral colonies and using them as breeding stock for restoration projects, essentially attempting to accelerate a process of adaptive selection that would otherwise take considerably longer to play out on its own, if it has time to play out at all under current warming rates. Some reef locations have also shown genuinely surprising resilience through recent bleaching events specifically because of unusual local oceanographic conditions, including areas with naturally higher water flow, deeper thermal refuges nearby, or coral populations that have already survived and adapted through repeated past stress events, effectively pre-selected for greater heat tolerance through exactly the kind of harsh, repeated exposure that's been devastating less resilient reef populations elsewhere. Researchers studying these specific locations describe them as genuinely important, both as potential source populations for future restoration efforts and as living case studies for understanding what specific conditions allow a reef to persist, even as global averages continue to decline. None of this amounts to a reason to expect reefs broadly to be fine. The honest right of the current science is that meaningful, sustained reef loss at a global scale is very likely locked in for at least the coming decades under any currently plausible warming trajectory, including relatively optimistic ones. But it does mean the future isn't a uniform, simple story of every reef everywhere disappearing at the same rate, and it means the specific, targeted conservation and restoration work happening right now at naturally resilient sites has a genuinely meaningful chance of preserving coral genetic diversity and localized reef function, even through a period of substantial broader decline, buying time and preserving options for whatever comes after this particular stretch of warming eventually stabilizes. I don't want to end on a list of vague suggestions that don't connect meaningfully to a problem this large, because that's its own way of trivializing the scale of what's actually happening. But it's also true that there's nothing an individual can do isn't an accurate conclusion to draw from any of this either, so it's worth being specific, rather than either overselling or dismissing individual action entirely. At the level of direct, concrete impact, supporting organizations actually engaged in coral restoration and heat-resilient breeding programs is one of the few individual actions with a reasonably clear, traceable line to the specific problem described in this video, since that work is directly aimed at preserving genetic diversity and buying time for reef systems through exactly the kind of compounding stress events discussed here. Reducing personal carbon footprint matters at the margin, though it's worth being honest that individual behavior change alone was never going to be sufficient to meaningfully shift a trajectory this large, driven overwhelmingly by large-scale industrial and energy sector emissions rather than individual consumer choices. Where individual action arguably carries more weight is in the more indirect, harder-to-measure category, supporting policy that accelerates the broader emissions trajectory shifting, since that's the lever that actually determines whether the 2050 near-annual bleaching projection holds or gets meaningfully pushed back. None of that is a satisfying, complete answer to a problem this size, and I'm not going to pretend it is. But I'd rather leave you with an accurate, appropriately modest picture of where individual leverage genuinely exists than either an inflated sense that switching a few habits solves this, or a defeated sense that nothing anyone does outside of major institutions matters at all. Both of those extremes are wrong, and both of them, in their own way, tend to lead to the same outcome: people checking out of the conversation entirely, which is exactly the outcome that helps this problem the least. I mentioned at the start that I put this video off, and I want to be honest about why, because I think it's a genuinely common reaction, and I don't think pretending I didn't have it makes for a more useful video. Environmental science, and climate-adjacent science specifically, produces a steady, almost relentless stream of bad news, and after enough of it, there's a real temptation, both for someone making videos about it and for someone watching them, to either tune it out entirely or to reach for a comforting conclusion that the underlying evidence doesn't actually support, just to make the story easier to sit with. I didn't want to make a video that ends on a note of, but there's still hope, so don't worry too much, because I don't think that's an honest read of what a formal scientific assessment identifying an already crossed tipping point is actually telling us. And I also didn't want to make a video that ends purely in despair, because that's not accurate either, and because despair, on its own, doesn't actually help anyone make better decisions about what happens next. What I landed on is something closer to this. The data is genuinely serious, more serious than most casual coverage of another bad bleaching year tends to convey, and it deserves to be treated with the weight it actually carries rather than folded into the general, slightly numbing background noise of ongoing climate news. At the same time, the story isn't finished. Individual reef systems and individual restoration efforts are still capable of making a real, measurable difference at a local level, even within a broader trajectory that remains genuinely concerning at the global scale. Both of those things are true simultaneously, and I think a video that only tells you one of them isn't actually giving you the full, honest picture. I don't have a tidy way to wrap this up, and I think reaching for one would be its own small dishonesty. The fourth global coral bleaching event is over, for now. Ocean temperatures remain measurably higher than they were during the first recorded event back in 1998, and the underlying warming trend driving that difference hasn't reversed or meaningfully slowed. Whether the fifth global bleaching event arrives in 5 years or 15 depends on factors that are, at this point, largely already in motion. What happens to any individual reef between now and then depends on a mix of local conditions, ongoing restoration work, and ultimately the broader trajectory of global emissions, a trajectory that remains, as of right now, genuinely undecided. If you've made it this far, I appreciate it, because I know this wasn't an easy watch, and it wasn't an easy one to put together either. I thought about cutting the uncertainty sections, the parts where I admit the forecasting has real limits or where researchers still disagree on how to frame the severity of what's happening, because a cleaner, more confident narrative is usually easier to watch and easier to make. But I think leaving that uncertainty in is actually more useful to you than smoothing it away, because it means when you see the next headline about reefs, whether it's genuinely alarming or genuinely hopeful, you'll have enough context to actually weigh it properly, instead of just reacting to whichever tone the headline happens to strike. That's the video I didn't want to make, because there's no clean bow to tie on the end of it, but I think it's the one that was actually worth making.